Okay, well, why don't we begin? Welcome everyone to our Chalk Talk tonight, which is called The Future of Stadium Design Post-COVID. And we're very fortunate to have with us Partho Dutta. Partho is a principal project designer and master planner with Populous. For those of you who don't know, Populous is one of the world's leading architectural design firms, and they have been involved in the creation of dozens of major sports venues around the globe. Partho himself, throughout his 26-year career in this space with a couple of different firms, has taken part in the design of such renowned venues as Yankee Stadium here in New York, Fusion Arena in Philadelphia, the renovation of Camp Nou in Barcelona, the Dubai Autodrome in UAE, the Sardar Patel Cricket Stadium in India, the French National Rugby Stadium in Paris, King Abdullah Sports Stadium in Saudi Arabia, New Perth Stadium in Australia, the FIFA World Cup stadiums in Brazil and Russia, and I could go on and on, but we want to hear Partho speak, so I'll stop right there. But
Oh my God.
Partho, you and I got to know each other about four to 5 years ago, when I was still at Columbia, you came in and actually guest lectured to my Science of Fandom class, and you got very much into, of course, this is pre-COVID, but you got very much into the new trends in stadium design, geared to the duality of building fan satisfaction and deriving revenues. So when we started this Chalk Talk series and we were hit with COVID, I thought it would be particularly interesting to have you come back and talk a little bit about your subject in the context of where we are today. So I'll turn it over to you. And I just want to once again say thank you so much for taking your time tonight to come on and talk to our group.
Absolutely. And thanks, Vince, for having me. And it's always a privilege to talk to you and to students. And it is really a lot of fun when you happen to work in the field that you really enjoy, and especially in a field where you're designing sports stadiums, or at least being part of it. I think that is really a privilege, and I'm always humbled by it. So in terms of I'll get right to the subject. And previously, when I had the class with you, when I presented sports facilities at that time, and of course even today, the main issue of revenue and creating products to enhance revenue, that was the main focus, and it hasn't changed. But what has happened is, with the pandemic coming in, it has caused essentially all kinds of hurdles, and one of the main ones is essentially that people just are not able to come to venues and stadiums and so on and so forth. So while the topic is about the future of stadium design, I think it would be good to kind of discuss a little bit about the more recent history that happened, I would say post February, March of this year, and how it affected the industry, and then what was done by the industry, not just us as architects and designers, but various other stakeholders, consultants, players, owners, and operators, what they did to kind of at least push the ball forward, to at least make sports events happen. And then, we're going to talk a little bit about, how much success there was in that, and then, of course, what we're looking towards in the future. So what happened was, everything was going fine, and we had a pretty healthy, healthy project roster, I would say, at the end of 2019, and I was working on Fusion Arena. That was one of the projects. It's an esports specific project in Philadelphia. and it's going to be, it was scheduled to be the the first esports specific arena that was going to be built in the US, in Philadelphia. And the project, the ownership is a joint kind of an investment by the Cordish Group and Comcast. And we were essentially nearly done with the design. We were seeking approvals. It was that stage when the project essentially slowed down and is currently on hold. And hopefully it's going to start next year. So so from a point where the owners actually took a lot of care in trying to extend all the different design work that we had before they decided to slow the process down. And then I started hearing, not just me, but all my colleagues started hearing from all other parts of the globe as things were slowing down in terms of sports events and occupancy in sports stadiums. And of course, then March Madness, and the collegiate, uh, you know, all of those events basically did not happen. And that was the time when, a bunch of my colleagues, as well as owners and operators, started talking to each other as to how do we really bring it back. And there were quite a few voices, and we started forming these roundtables where we would talk to either the operators or the ownerships and so on and so forth. But soon we realized that we would need some kind of a consensus and also try to understand where the fans, the spectators are coming from, because there was no concrete evidence in terms of what are they thinking, what is the fan thinking, are they willing to come back. So, one of the first things we did was we sponsored a spectator survey in North America, in Canada, and in the US. And I'm going to show you a few slides from that. I'll just share my screen. And so basically, we did this survey with this company called Navigate, which is a company that does professional surveys. And we essentially, both for professional collegiate fans, trying to understand their perceptions and opinions, returning back to the venues. And this survey, it's public right now, and I can potentially share it at the end of end of the presentation. But these are the main questions that we were asking. And some of the information that we got back, this kind of walks you through how the survey was done, how the sample was balanced, how many attendees were there for the survey, and so on and so forth, and what are the different kinds of industries that we kind of targeted on. And one of the big things that came out of this was 87% of respondents plan to return to sports before there is a vaccine, which gave us a lot of hope that if we create an environment that is safe, or as safe as possible, based on CDC guidelines, we could potentially create an environment where fans could at least attend some form of events. And and then there were some nuances that we kind of looked at. Some of the folks said that when the current lockdown in my area is lifted, I feel comfortable going back to sports venues. I'm willing to follow any venue rule that it means to attend sports concerts in the future. And at that time, this when we did the survey, it was a few months into the lockdown, and people were feeling that they needed to go out, that they needed to experience something in the form of live entertainment and also see other people. But they weren't confident enough to go out and do it on their own. They needed some kind of guidelines. Um, and then, how do the fans feel overall? 60% of the fans said they intended to keep practicing social distancing measures after a COVID-19 vaccine is available. and up to 50% of the parents feel comfortable taking their children to sporting and entertainment events. Um, and overall, all of these kind of things were asked, and as we went through the surveys, and the surveys lasted for quite a long duration, and then we had follow-up questions as well. Um, we basically, found more and more things that were interesting. For example, when asked if venues would implement just three safety measures, the following rise to the top as the most important. And I think one of the most important was spacing um, between attendees and masks to be worn. And then, of course, the disinfecting of the surfaces throughout the event. So, we tried to look at these three as like the prime goals and then set about figuring out how to apply this. And in the next set of slides that I'm going to show you after I finish this one, I'm going to walk you through how we went about this whole launching of the reopening of facilities. So essentially, it you know this was another interesting thing that we found was that more people were willing to attend an outdoor venue or an open air venue as opposed to a closed indoor venue. That was really interesting for us. Even though some of the when we asked some of our mechanical engineers and environmental engineers, they basically said that the volume of air in the indoor at that time, this is very preliminary in the data, that it might be similar, but perception plays a big part. And an open air outdoor venue seem to be more acceptable to people. Um, Tailgating in the future, this was a very, very interesting and important concept that we further built on and actually are building products on right now. Um, it seems that there was a major interest in a temporary fan zone facility, but nearly 4 in 10 strongly agreed that they would rather just watch from home. So one of the things we took away from this is how can we make the fan zone very interesting, and where would we form the fan zone? And the story behind this is basically, if you think of the way stadiums are designed, all we're doing is trying to place a certain number of people in close proximity, as close proximity as possible, in a safe environment close to the field of play. But once you have COVID, and then there are restrictions in terms of at least 6 feet from each other and so on and so forth. That's when you realize that you can only host so many folks in the stadium. So then, how do you meet the expectations of the other folks that would like to come to the venue but can't? And that's where the whole idea of the fan zone kind of developed. We took from the idea of fan zones in the Olympics, the World Cup, and then how do we create something like that which would essentially have nearly all of those amenities that are in stadium, but you build it in a temporary way outside the stadium. So we're still working on some of those ideas. Um, Despite venue type, there are concerns about how venues will be handling safety precautions. I think venue touch points was the biggest thing, and we did quite a bit of research with manufacturers of cleaning products and different kinds of scientific equipment to understand how we could actually disinfect much more effectively. And we created a series of do's and don'ts and specs to essentially equip owners and operators to be able to launch those kind of protocols. Then there were things about, most concerning venue touch points, and these were, obviously quite a few of them. Restrooms and toilets was one of the biggest ones in F&B areas. I think, again, work on all of these things began in earnest as to how do we rethink the design of all of these items, and how do we allow people to use them, since only so many people can use these at a time, just to keep in line with some of those safe measures that are being dictated by the CDC. And then trying to understand where fans would really spend money, and then trying to apply it to the relay of the re-overlaying of the event on the stadium. Fans basically said that the top 5 factors in their willingness to spend money on concessions merchandise included, things like hand sanitizers, limited interaction with folks, and then is it possible to order and pick up at the counter? Contactless transactions were also a big thing. Then we did some more queries into, the contactless point of sale, the whole method of ordering, pickup, and delivery. And we really got into understanding the whole process of queuing and then reducing the idea of queuing. And we talked to various software manufacturers and app manufacturers who would help create apps where patrons would have that on their phones. They would order, and once their order would come in, they would be able to go and pick it up, and that would ensure that a limited number of people are always in the concession stands or nearabouts. Then we also looked at generational personas. What do the millennials want versus Gen X, the older and elderly folks, and so on and so forth. And we created profiles of what are the needs for each of these categories and groups, and what do they want out of live events. And I don't want to go through all of this. Communication with fans, one of the big things we found out that even though the CDC had very clear directives in terms of what is a do and what is a don't, it was difficult, especially in a stadium environment when there is an event going on, in the excitement of the event. A lot of these rules that are to be followed could be forgotten. And so we created a whole method of, how do we communicate all this information to the fans in the most effective way as possible? Is it through videos? Is it through apps? Is it just static signage? But we created this entire overlay where all of these things would be in place in the stadium. Then we basically came down to solutions that were supposed to be implemented. And that's kind of where we left this one off. Now, what essentially happened after this was, the next stage was, let me just open this up. I'm sorry, just a second. Okay, yeah, this is. Yeah, this is good. Let me just share this screen. Okay. So after we did that, the first survey, we actually shared it with various clients, operators, and so on and so forth. And that's when we started getting contacted about, well, how do we implement this? And we started working with various groups, professional groups, collegiate groups, so on and so forth, to see how we can effectively implement it. And it was very interesting because, the whole notion of trying to fit the right number of patrons in stadiums, that itself caused us to create our own software for just a seating profile on on existing stadium seat layouts. And that led us to creating what we call the venue readiness plans. And we created there was always the first one, which kind of got, refined into, Gen 2, Gen 3, until we kind of rested at, okay, if it's an indoor facility, these are the things you need to do. If it's MLS, then it's this is the way it's going to happen, and so on and so forth, versus MLB and so on and so forth. And So this presentation that we have is kind of a culmination of what we eventually did, for most most facilities. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to sit down with the clientele and understand and listen and collect all the information that they had in understanding what their background was, how to implement it, and how they wanted the event uh, to be to happen, uh, following some of those CDC rules, but not dilute the effects. And then, of course, we created various solutions, which we tried out in certain areas, and then finally there was the implementation. Um, so, so essentially, how this was done was by creating these roundtables. And so essentially we had the collegiate think tank, and then we have the event roundtable. And basically you can see all of these folks and groups were participating as we developed some of these ideas. And some of them would, kind of come in and join us and participate and give their expertise and go away while we kept developing it. And we basically touched base with nearly all of these leads that are mentioned below, both here in the US and abroad. Again, it was all back to 87% of the fans who plan to return before there's a vaccine, and 67% of the fans are willing to follow any venue rules if it means attending sports concerts and venues in the future. So what were the key takeaways? The key takeaways was we need to create a defined separation. The need for separation and the correct way of doing it, that needs to be defined. Whether it's in groups or whether it's individuals, we need to do that. The other thing was to understand what are the constraints and the pinch points in stadium facilities. So eventually, you'll see how we divided the stadium into, a few different zones, which could be serviced really easily and which could be monitored much more easily. One of the things that we understood from the doctors of the CDC was that, all of these mitigation measures that they were talking about, each had a pro and con. And if you applied only one of them, it was not going to be successful. The only way to kind of be successful is to layer them up, almost like a stack of Swiss cheese. So even if there are holes in one solution, if you stack them up, you will basically most probably get a positive result. So that was something that we adopted in a big way. And we kind of tried to control the transitions between high capacity versus low capacity zones, uh, trying to keep, create efficiency by creating efficiency based on social distancing. And what we found was initially we were trying to implement the same kind of idea on different venues, and we found out that all of the solutions had to be bespoke. So strategies. So the whole idea of the 6-foot distancing, what did that mean? And one of the things that we actually, when we implemented our app, creates a 6-foot distance, not from the nose to nose, but from your shoulder to shoulder. So eventually it's actually down to a 7-foot distancing that ends up. The whole notion of a nonlinear timeline. And, from what we understood was, this is kind of like a graphic that shows, the whole explosion of the whole pandemic, and then how things kind of slowed down a little bit. And these things haven't happened yet. And always there's going to be a precautionary period until the time when we think there's going to be a normalcy. All the strategies that we are trying to design and implement, they're all flexible. And, it's basically by applying these basic principles to individual events or stadia. So up till now, what we have done is we've been able to do, at least when this presentation was created, was 30 plus readiness plans. And we're still doing them for clients from all across the globe. So the way it works is we create, we have a set of readiness guidelines which we've developed based on the surveys, our conversation in the event table, event roundtables, as well as our conversations with the experts. And based on that, we've gone to the venue and created what we call a restart plan. So these things, both of these two are kind of done very quickly. But the restart plan, the implementation of it, and once you get into stakeholder overlays, that's what takes quite a bit of time and are slowly developed in concert with the client. So decision making and implementation, once you get the readiness guidelines, they affect the facility and the operations plan. We need to create clear and collaborative messaging. The moment you buy a ticket, you basically start getting messages through your app in understanding how the venue will function and how you're supposed to behave and work in the venue. And then understanding what the immediate strategies are and what are the long-term strategies. So these are the readiness guidelines and where they affect. We work on the guidelines from a site point of view, and these are some of the elements. Fan and stop parking strategies. So, for example, when you're going to park your car, where you're going to park your car, the time, where you're supposed to go from the parking to the venue, how the checking of your health, your ticketing, and the equipment that you have with you, which locations they will be checked. Once you're in the stadium or the venue, in which zone are you sitting? Because the stadium itself is divided into zones now. The efficiency of the seating bowl and the type of seating that you're part of. If you're in a 2-seater versus a 10-seater, how does that work? These plans are implemented for all building levels, area designations, flow directions. They do take care of disabled patrons or people with mobility issues. There are previous guidelines given on what happens in case of an emergency, how people are egressed out. All those things are kind of looked at. Also, restrooms and food and beverage. That's all either through an app or your designated usher who's going to let you know if certain areas are okay to go and visit to at least limit the amount of crowding that happens normally. Premium areas are dealt in a slightly different way, and again, every league has done it differently. If you look at the NFL versus the MLS, I think they're all doing it slightly differently based on some of these recommendations. There are additional things that we had developed, but some of them did not get implemented or were in the process of implementing one or two. And they range from media overlay solutions, environmental graphics. Environmental graphics was one of the pieces that we got a lot of work on, and it ranged from not just the new kind of signage that needs to be in the stadiums, but also communication graphics in terms of videos to the spectators for them to understand what they would expect once they were in the venue. So this was basically the work that we created, and we were kind of successful at helping not just the leagues but the operators in helping their patrons and spectators to get into the stadium. The next phase that we're looking at and we're developing is some of those things that were not touched on in the last phase. And one of the big things we're looking at is how to activate the fan zones to have a greater amount of footfalls, even outside the stadiums, especially stadiums that have a large surface parking area or a bit of land in walking distance proximity to the stadium facility. We're creating fan zones so that patrons can actually come and enjoy the event, and a limited number can be in the stadium while most of them are outside. So some of these things are still being developed and evolving, but essentially the way we think about venues and stadiums has changed quite a bit. We're trying to still increase, the revenues for the stadium, and of course, with limited number of folks in the venue, there's definitely a hit in terms of the revenue, but at least there is hope that people are at least wanting to return to a live event. So it's all a work in progress.
So, I thought at this point, I want to remind everyone to type a question into the chat, if you will. And when we get your question, I can open your mic up and you can ask it yourself. So in the meantime, while people are thinking about their questions, one of the discussions you and I had recently was the topic of ingress and egress, moving in and out of an arena. And I thought this would be a major concern. And you said, and your point was, given the reduced capacity that we're seeing with social distancing, that actually sort of takes care of itself, right? Is that?
Yeah. So essentially, just going back to the basics of, understanding egress, especially in cases of emergency. So most of the benchmarks for stadium evacuation, especially if there is a big emergency incident in a stadium, it's all based on the notion that patrons in any section of the stadium or an arena or any venue for that matter have to basically move from their seat to a relative place of safety in between 8 to 15 minutes. So, that is like the benchmark for stadiums all around the world. And it's been accepted by nearly all the building codes around the world. And even the FIFA and IOC kind of accept that. So when you have a stadium of approximately, 30,000, 40,000, maybe 60,000, or even more, they all have to perform in the same way. Those are the same benchmarks that are given. So you can imagine that in a stadium that generally holds 30 to 40,000 seats, if you have only, 10 to 12,000, the exiting becomes very, very easy. And in terms of emergency, the issue is not that bad because you have many, many more exits and the flow rates increase and people are out in much shorter times.
Yeah. Any questions from the group? I look at the names of people here. Caroline, did you have something you would like to ask Partho?
Oh, I saw somebody had a comment on my camera screen. So I'll tell you the story behind that is, I'm actually not in the office, as you obviously know from my background, but I'm on my dining table and I have a very limited real estate, and so I have put the 3 screens almost in a circle, and I have to kind of turn my head to whichever screen the presentation comes up on. And this has been a complaint from a lot of my colleagues and my clients that, why is your head in the right place? It is not.
Caroline, did you have a question? I unmuted you. Can you speak? Your hand is raised, right?
Oh, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was typing it in the chat. Hi, Partho.
Okay.
Hi, Caroline.
Today, I think I just hit send on it actually. But this has been great. My question is around financing. I guess I know you're more on the design and structure, but do you foresee stadium financing changing as a result of COVID-19? I mean, right now we've seen more and more stadiums being fully privately funded, which is a huge expense. We've seen that with, I think SoFi was mostly privately funded, and then we're seeing them less a combination of public-private. But do you foresee that shifting in the post-COVID-19 era?
That's a very interesting question. I think, if you look at SoFi Stadium itself, it is a very large stadium. And I think if you think of the nature of and the NFL stadiums, they were always, there was always the growth and from the stadiums of, I think if you trace it from like the 70s, late 70s to the 80s when the next stadium boom happened to now, there's always been an increase in the square footage of the NFL stadium, right? And it's obvious the reasons. It's the most popular sport in the country, and the Super Bowl is attended by more folks than I think the Olympics, from what I understand. And there is a massive popularity for a sport like that. And because the number of events in the NFL are much lower than, let's say, baseball, a larger number of patrons and spectators want to come to those events. But what has happened in terms of stadium, if you look at the evolution of the stadium type, especially if you look at internationally, a lot of the stadiums are kind of hitting a ceiling in terms of capacity. And beyond that, what they're doing is by keeping a certain capacity number as their ceiling, they're actually adding more and more products in the stadium. So, if you ask me in terms of stadium, are there going to be investors in stadiums, and is stadium financing going to be available for projects? I would say yes. This is not something that's going to be going away. Even after the pandemic started, we ourselves have we ourselves have started designing new facilities. Like I'm working on one. It's a confidential project, but I can only say that it's in Toronto, in Canada, and it is a brand new facility. So which tells me that there is definitely room for investment, and the investors look at this as something that has a finite length in terms of the pandemic. And then eventually, there's going to be an evolution from, okay, the pandemic phase to normalcy, and that's going to take its own time and its own evolution, but it is definitely going to happen.
Professor Abrams, did you want to weigh in on that and also ask your question as well?
Sure. Thanks, Vince. I was just wondering if, from a populist standpoint, does CapEx go up much more in the next few years and into the future? Like, what's a permanent fixture because of COVID-19? And what do you see, the changes in stadium construction, the impact of COVID that will live with us for the next generation or so?
Right.
From a cost.
No, that's a very good question, because when we, when the pandemic hit, we had, as can be imagined, we had many projects in different phases, right? So some of them were on the drawing boards, some of them were, about to be going into bids, but some of them were under construction. And the question that the ownerships asked us, like, what do we do, because we're under construction and we know that we have to do all these things that you guys are talking about. Do we need to spend more money to prevent or which will at least help patrons to come into the stadium? And what we saw was, beyond a certain few things, there was not really much in terms of infrastructural capex or a large increase in that. It was really, okay, instead of this material, maybe you want to change the spec and look at another material which might perform better from a cleaning point of view, and so on and so forth. Also, the other portion of it, which was, okay, now since we have social distancing, does every seat need to be like 6 feet away? And again, we looked at all those different models, and we found that no, you cannot design it in that way. because once the pandemic goes away, what do you do with all that real estate? Instead, what we decided was that, let's figure out a differential of in-stadium capacity and capacity of spectators who are outside the stadium. Well, the question was more about, well, how do you bring something similar to that live experience to facilities, to the areas that are like fan zones, which could be developed and give the spectators and fans a similar kind of an experience and allow them to come to the stadium precinct rather than trying to expand the stadium infrastructure itself. So the only increase in cost was the overlay cost, which is more an operating cost than a capex. So I think that's kind of the way we approached it.
Yeah. Professor DeLuca, would you like to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely.
Partho, thank you. I'm interested from a liability standpoint. Are you finding anyone getting involved in supplying, how do you handle liability of either participants, either with colleges, municipalities, or stadium authorities dealing with people who attend, either participants or fans, who may fall ill and want to come after the facility? Is there a growing market there?
Well, to be very honest, right now at least I would not know about any incident like that, or it hasn't come to light with me. I can inquire about it if anything like that has happened. I've heard of, of course, it's not that that all of the attendances has absolutely been fine. There have been incidents which we've read in newspapers where some attendees might have gotten sick after whatever they experience. It is not a foolproof method, and that was something that the doctors at the CDC that we were consulting with mentioned to us. I think we know that risk is there. Now, the implementation of all of this is entirely done by the stadium operators, the ownerships, and it is their guidance that goes into what a spectator signs on when they come to the stadium. So I don't know much about that part of it, but I can inquire and find out.
Thank you.
And Partho, you take COVID out of the picture for a moment and look at down the road, comfortably post-COVID, let's call it, whether it's 18 months from now or 2 to 3 years from now. We were seeing some trends prior to COVID that suggested that we were trying to build communal areas into stadiums and arenas. Right. You've seen people take out static seats and put in congregating areas where people could be in community, sort of making the game on the field, on the court, only one of the elements that you come for versus what we saw 30 years ago when all eyes were on one place, right? Right. What are some of the implications for that trend going forward? And what were some of the things that you were working on and maybe will continue to work on again as you get into that post-COVID environment that are spaces for congregation? And how do you see that changing from 10 years ago when you were designing?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting story. If you look at the history of sports facilities and you go back to the old days of Wrigley Field or any of the soccer fields in Europe, a large number of spectators would be standing spectators, and they would congregate. And even today, or even before the pandemic happened, if you look at the end zone stands of Schalke Stadium in Dortmund, the real hardcore fans they actually stand throughout the game, and that's considered as like, wow, what an atmosphere. And to a large extent, and again, this is before the pandemic, the Green Guide, which is the group that essentially does a lot of research on safety at sports facilities. They were the group, they were reticent in acknowledging or agreeing to allowing standing spectators. But it was only last year that they allowed the implementation of some standing room areas as part of their recommendations, which was really interesting. And Tottenham Hotspur, the new stadium that Populous did in London, actually has one of the end zones the fans stand as able to host standing spectators. Not only that, but there were also, decks, which were specialized to kind of host areas that were like standing and congregation areas, serving food and drinks, and there would be a screen showing the game that was more about the interaction than anything else. And those were tremendous products. Some of the field suites were an idea out of that, where you could be close to the players, but once the event started, you could go to the lower bowl and sit and watch the game. Well, some of those ideas, one thing is that once normalcy comes back, those areas will still be valid. And it's not that the development of those areas will reduce, but I think they will be used in a different way. And as I mentioned, some of those special areas might spill outside the stadium in the stadium precinct, where one of the ideas that we were trying out was that, well, if you, let's say you have a group of, let's say, 100 spectators that come, and we create a solution where, and this was for soccer, that in the first half, maybe, 30 fans can go in while the rest of them enjoy the fan zone outside with all the food and beverage and live video offering. And then after halftime, it's the next 30 that go in. And so at least, half of that capacity of 100 has actually experienced the live game. But you've allowed, 100 of them to actually come to the precinct and enjoy the event with their friends. So there are quite a few of these kind of things that will probably develop as overlays and become more significant. And that will certainly have an impact on, the stadium size, which I think Caroline was asking, that do we really need stadiums to be that big? Maybe we can do with smaller facilities that are kind of more focused, and then have a piece of land outside, which is more community space, which could grow, similar to the Super Bowl as the event happens there. So I think that's kind of a way to look at it.
Yeah, and you add to that equation the evolution and really revolution in media, and you think about all of the ways that we're going to be able to consume a live sporting event that will draw us away from the venue.
Right.
The virtual season ticket, right? Sitting behind the Lakers bench and watching the game, but doing it while you're sitting in Beijing or Toronto or San Francisco or anywhere in the world. So when you start to think of that, it does make this right sizing, because there's significant capital involved.
Right.
And to get the return on investment, it makes right sizing quite an interesting question. And there's so much happening and it's so dynamic. It's really hard to put your finger on what the optimal size is. I always had this, my imagination. I always thought that, we would get there and, I don't know by what time, 2030 or sometime, where we were building 15,000 seat Major League Baseball stadiums. Now you may not, like that, but although I think there'll be some intricate design work to go into that, but they were essentially theaters.
Right.
They were performance theaters, and we would have people all over the world watching these live games as if they were in the venue, maybe even with the sensory perception of smelling the hot dogs, right?
No, absolutely.
Technology is getting us there. So it's going to be interesting to see if the 60,000, 80,000 seat stadium become an anachronism.
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting point. And you know, a large part of our design team actually thinks exactly in the same way. That, you know, it's not really the larger stadiums that are gonna be more successful in terms of hosting more events. It is really, you know, the more right-sized, you know, medium-sized facilities, along with, you know, some amount of precinct area that will actually allow you to host, you know, multiple events. One of the very, very interesting things that we learned was from esports venues, and that was one project type that kind of kept happening, and we were getting more and more work from esports venues from all around the world than any other kind of program. And one of the reasons for that was, you know, these venues are not very large, and they, you know, a large part of these esports venues, they're for training and also for public participation, for the public to come in and use the same kind of, you know, training areas that the esports athletes or the esports practitioners actually train on or perform on, and so on and so forth. And you know, so the evolution of that program is becoming like, okay, the same facility that can host an esports arena is also the same kind of configuration that can host, you know, from you know, a music kind of a venue or a concert venue or even an opera venue, you know. So there you start layering all these users, and then you stack in, you know, okay, well, if that is true, and this is something, a program that is catered towards a very young crowd, on one hand, so you have the esports, and then you have the music and the opera, that's the slightly, you know, older crowd. And then what are the programs that go with it? You know, so you have like, okay, what are the dining experiences that can come in? And so you immediately start forming ranges of, okay, this is the stuff that can happen. But then what's the amount of area in terms of land that you need? Even though the footprint of you know, these facilities is tiny compared to, you know, you're looking at, you know, 5,000, 10,000 maximum, you know, in terms of capacity, and the larger numbers are really in Asia, not here. But you're looking at a lot of plaza space, so there's a lot of activation happening outside these venues, and that gives you an immediate idea of, okay, this is where something with so much investment in technology is going. So what's going to happen to, you know, the other sports? And you're absolutely right, Vince. You know, we think that it might actually go that way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're just about towards the end of our time here, and I just want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your experiences and thoughts. I think it's you know, your presentation and discussion has been provocative and certainly given us a lot to think about the future of stadium design and the future of the industry, really. So thanks again. We'll end this session, and we really appreciate you spending your time, Partho.
It's always a pleasure.
And I look forward to catching up with you again very soon.
Absolutely. And if you have any queries about, you know, what is going to happen in the future, or what's happening in 2021 and how things are developing, you know, I can have a you know, a follow-up maybe in end of January or February to let you know how we've worked with the NHL and all of those other leagues that deal more with indoor facilities, and how all that is getting implemented, and even the convention center industry, how that's being implemented.
Excellent. You mentioned that, did you say you were able to or not able to share the Navigate study?
Yeah, I can share these both of these with you.
Okay, that would be great if you send them to me.
I'll email it to you. And
that's wonderful.
Distribute it. Okay.
Thanks again, and have a great rest of your evening.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks. Bye.